I do contract work, mostly IT audits, some data recovery, the kind of jobs that come from companies downsizing or quietly merging and needing someone external to inventory what's left behind. It's not interesting work. It pays because it's boring and because I'm willing to dig through things other people don't want to look at. Old servers, abandoned SharePoint instances, forgotten backup tapes. I spend time on fringe forums because that's where leaked documentation tends to surface first. And sometimes it helps to know what's circulating before a client asks about it. After a while, it also just becomes habit. I check them the same way other people check news. The thread was on a small invite-only board that mostly reposts dead links. The title was a string of characters and a date stamp, nothing descriptive. No replies. The post body had an onion link, ASHA 256, checksum, and that was it. No explanation, no warning. That wasn't unusual. Most of those threads are either scams or mirrors of things that have already been scraped elsewhere. I clicked it later that night. Not immediately. I remember because I was half watching a game replay and waiting on a local hash verification to finish. It was around 23:40 my time. I had 3 terminals open. Coffee I shouldn't have been drinking that late. And my apartment was quiet, except for the building's HVAC cycling. I routed through Tor, loaded the link, expected a timeout. Instead, it resolved cleanly. The page that loaded didn't look like most hidden services. No splash screen, no manifesto, no branding. It was just a directory listing. White background, black text, default font. The header read, Library. Below it were folders, arranged alphabetically, each named with a 4-digit year. I noticed right away that some of the years were ahead of the current one, but I didn't register that as significant yet. People mislabel things all the time. I assumed it was either fictional or mislabeled archival material. I checked the page source. Nothing embedded. No trackers I could see. The server response headers were sparse but clean. The permissions were Every folder showed the same modified timestamp down to the second. That stood out more to me than the dates. It suggested a bulk operation, not organic uploads. I clicked one of the earlier years at random. Inside were subfolders with numeric IDs and short descriptors. CivOps, EduCant, Meds. The names felt administrative, like internal abbreviations. Each folder contained PDFs, CSVs, and a few image files with standardized naming conventions. No thumbnails. No previews. I didn't open anything yet. I went back to the root and checked for a README or an About page. There wasn't one. I mirrored the directory structure locally without downloading the contents, just to get a sense of scale. It was larger than I expected. Hundreds of folders. Thousands of files, based on the index. At that point, it still felt like a curiosity. Maybe a roleplay archive. Maybe someone dumping fabricated reports. The interface was too plain to be trying to scare anyone. It looked like something built for internal use and then forgotten. I downloaded a single file from the root index_master.csv. It was small enough to check quickly. When I opened it, I noticed the internal column headers matched a classification schema I'd seen before in real disaster response documentation. Event IDs, continuity phase markers, loss metrics. Not exact matches, but close enough that it made me pause. I didn't feel alarmed then. Mostly, I was interested in who had gone to the trouble of organizing it this way, and why no one else seemed to be talking about it. I opened the index file offline the next morning. That was intentional, more habit than concern. I like to separate review from access when I'm not sure what something is. The CSV opened cleanly. No macros, no hidden sheets. It was structured into two main sections, separated by a blank line and a repeated header row. Both sections used the same fields, but the values diverged quickly. Each section was tagged in the collection _type column as cultural continuity _event. That phrasing caught my attention, but not in a dramatic way. It read like internal jargon. Something someone would come up with to avoid saying failure or collapse in a report that had to circulate. I assumed it was either academic or speculative. There was no legend explaining it. The file listings were dense. Municipal after-action reports, public works summaries, hospital capacity tables broken down by week, education department closure notices. Most of the file names followed a strict pattern. Region _code -DEPT -date-rev. The revisions went further than I expected. Some documents were on their 7th or 8th version. That implied review cycles, not a one-off dump. I sampled a few PDFs from the earlier section, opening them in a sandboxed viewer. The language was flat. Staffing shortfalls, service interruptions, compliance issues. Nothing sensational. Even where entire neighborhoods were referenced, it was in terms of coverage, percentages, and response windows. There were image files too, but they were mostly stills pulled from fixed cameras, intersections, hallways, exterior, shots of buildings with timestamps burned in. Large areas of each image were blacked out, with redaction labels embedded directly into the file rather than overlaid later. What stood out was how normal it all sounded. I've read real incident documentation for floods and fires, and this was similar in tone. No narrative, no commentary, just outcomes. I cross-referenced one municipal report with a public database I have access to through previous work. Same formatting, same header structure. Even the footer disclaimer matched, down to a typo I recognized. That made me slow down. It didn't mean the content was real, but it meant whoever made it knew how real ones are built. That takes time or experience. At that point, I considered stopping, not because I thought it was dangerous, but because I couldn't see an immediate reason to keep going. Unvetted material like this can turn into a time sink, and I had actual work queued. I remember thinking I'd already spent enough unpaid hours on other people's curiosities. Still, I kept reading the index. The first collection was labeled with years that were behind the current one. On paper, it looked historical, but none of the events lined up with things I knew had happened. Regions that hadn't seen major disruptions had extensive documentation. Other places that should have had something didn't appear at all. The dates also didn't match known. School closures months before any recorded cause. Hospital surge plans activated with no corresponding public alerts. I didn't try to explain that yet. Data gaps happen. Archives get incomplete. I made notes in the margin of the CSV and flagged a few entries as anomalies. The second collection used future years. That felt like either speculation or projection. I ignored it for the time being. I wasn't interested in predictions, and I didn't want to contaminate my read of the earlier material by jumping ahead. Near the top of the first collection was a folder labeled pilot_archive_01, smaller than the others. Fewer files. It had its own internal index, which suggested it had been assembled separately and then integrated. That's common with test datasets. I isolated that folder locally and created a read log, just a simple text file noting timestamps and file names as I opened them. That's something I do when I'm not sure if I'll need to justify how I handled material later. At the time, it still felt like professional caution, not evidence handling. Looking back, that was probably the point where it stopped being just another archive. I didn't realize that yet. I just thought I was being thorough. I opened the index file offline the next morning. That was intentional, more habit than concern. I like to separate review from access when I'm not sure what something is. The CSV opened cleanly. No macros, no hidden sheets. It was structured into two main sections, separated by a blank line and a repeated header row. Both sections used the same fields, but the values diverged quickly. Each section was tagged in the collection _type column as cultural continuity _event. That phrasing caught my attention, but not in a dramatic way. It read like internal jargon. Something someone would come up with to avoid saying failure or collapse in a report that had to circulate. I assumed it was either academic or speculative. There was no legend explaining it. The file listings were dense. Municipal after-action reports, public works summaries, hospital capacity tables broken down by week, education department closure notices. Most of the file names followed a strict pattern: region _code -DEPT-date-rev. The revisions went further than I expected. Some documents were on their 7th or 8th version. That implied review cycles, not a one-off dump. I sampled a few PDFs from the earlier section, opening them in a sandboxed viewer. The language was flat. Staffing shortfalls, service interruptions, compliance issues. Nothing sensational. Even where entire neighborhoods were referenced, it was in terms of coverage, percentages, and response windows. There were image files too, but they were mostly stills pulled from fixed cameras, intersections, hallways, exterior, shots of buildings with timestamps burned in. Large areas of each image were blacked out, with redaction labels embedded directly into the file rather than overlaid later. What stood out was how normal it all sounded. I've read real incident documentation for floods and fires, and this was similar in tone. No narrative, no commentary, just outcomes. I cross-referenced one municipal report with a public database I have access to through previous work. Same formatting, same header structure. Even the footer disclaimer matched, down to a typo I recognized. That made me slow down. It didn't mean the content was real, but it meant whoever made it knew how real ones are built. That takes time or experience. At that point, I considered stopping, not because I thought it was dangerous, but because I couldn't see an immediate reason to keep going. Unvetted material like this can turn into a time sink, and I had actual work queued. I remember thinking I'd already spent enough unpaid hours on other people's curiosities. Still, I kept reading the index. The first collection was labeled with years that were behind the current one. On paper, it looked historical, but none of the events lined up with things I knew had happened. Regions that hadn't seen major disruptions had extensive documentation. Other places that should have had something didn't appear at all. The dates also didn't match known. School closures months before any recorded cause. Hospital surge plans activated with no corresponding public alerts. I didn't try to explain that yet. Data gaps happen. Archives get incomplete. I made notes in the margin of the CSV and flagged a few entries as anomalies. The second collection used future years. That felt like either speculation or projection. I ignored it for the time being. I wasn't interested in predictions, and I didn't want to contaminate my read of the earlier material by jumping ahead. Near the top of the first collection was a folder labeled pilot_archive_01, smaller than the others. Fewer files. It had its own internal index, which suggested it had been assembled separately and then integrated. That's common with test datasets. I isolated that folder locally and created a read log, just a simple text file noting timestamps and file names as I opened them. That's something I do when I'm not sure if I'll need to justify how I handled material later. At the time, it still felt like professional caution, not evidence handling. Looking back, that was probably the point where it stopped being just another archive. I didn't realize that yet. I just thought I was being thorough. I started with the pilot archive because it was contained, fewer variables. The first document I opened was a town-level report, about 20 pages, finalized 3 weeks after the listed incident window. It read like a standard after-action summary. Header, scope, methodology, no narrative section, just findings. Utilities, uptime percentages, emergency staffing ratios, compliance notes. The tone didn't shift even when the numbers did. I didn't understand what had happened in that town at first. There was no overview, no cause listed. I had to reconstruct it by comparing revision histories. Early drafts mentioned full staffing. Later ones quietly removed entire departments from the tables. By the final revision, public safety was marked. Known operational, but there was no explanation attached. Just a footnote referencing an internal annex that wasn't included. I moved between documents, matching timestamps. A sanitation memo updated its assumptions 2 days before a hospital surge table reflected increased load. A school closure notice cited environmental conditions, but the environmental report itself was missing. The sequence suggested an event, but the event itself was never described. Everything was downstream of it. There were CCTV stills embedded in some files, referenced by frame number. The images themselves were mostly redacted, but the captions remained. Frame 1-442-2-2-31-4489-0 an exterior municipal annex frame 209-001-209-17 interior corredor. No personnel present. The gaps between frames were sometimes hours, sometimes days. I noticed that later reports stopped requesting footage altogether, as if no one expected it to exist anymore. One file included a body camera audit log. Not footage, just the audit. It listed devices by serial number and last recorded activity. Most entries ended with data una by lovely. A few had timestamps that extended well past the point when the department was marked inactive. I didn't know what to do with that, so I noted it and moved on. There was a voicemail transcript attached to a communications appendix. It was labeled as a final inbound message and time-stamped late in the sequence. The transcript was 1 line long. It read, "We're still here, but I don't think anyone's listening now." There was no attribution beyond a truncated ID. No follow-up. What struck me wasn't the content so much as how it was handled. The transcript wasn't highlighted or flagged. It sat between 2 automated system alerts, treated as equivalent data. The next revision removed it entirely, replaced with a placeholder indicating non-actionable input. As I worked through more towns, the pattern held. Different regions, same structure. Institutions persisted on paper longer than they seemed to in reality. Payroll reports continued after staffing tables showed 0 filled positions. Compliance audits were completed with entire sections marked "not observed." The documents assumed continuity even when there was none. I found myself double-checking dates more often. The reports weren't written during whatever had happened. They were written after, weeks after, sometimes months. There were references to recovery posture without any evidence of recovery. The language stayed procedural. It didn't adapt to circumstances. It just kept filling fields. I took breaks more frequently than usual, not because of distress, exactly, more because my attention kept slipping. It's hard to stay engaged when nothing reacts the way it should. I remember standing up to make coffee and realizing I'd been staring at the same table for 10 minutes, trying to understand how a library system could submit quarterly metrics with no branches listed as operational. Looking back, that was probably when I should have stopped. The archive wasn't incomplete. It was complete in a way that excluded experience. There was no attempt to make sense of anything, just to log it. By the end of the pilot folder, I understood that this wasn't a warning archive. It wasn't trying to show how things went wrong or how to prevent it. It was documenting what remained functional after everything else stopped, and doing so as long as there was still someone or something to file the report. I put off opening the second collection for a day, not deliberately. I had other work, and I told myself there was no reason to rush. When I did go back to it, it was late again, after I'd already logged a full day. That's when I tend to do this kind of reading. Fewer interruptions, less temptation to summarize things prematurely. The structure was different immediately. Where the first collection grouped material by location and year, this one grouped by project code. Alphanumeric strings, consistent length, no descriptive names. Each project folder contained the same internal layout: approvals, budgets, protocols, outputs. It felt active, not a record of something finished, but something that expected continuation. The approvals caught my attention first. Ethics waivers, mostly. Not absent, just abbreviated. A lot of expedited review language. Jurisdictional handoff. One document showed a review committee dissolving midway, through a project and responsibility transferring to an interim office with a slightly different name. The signatures were digital, time-stamped within minutes of each other, as if the process had been compressed to keep things moving. Funding ledgers were detailed. Line items broken down by quarter. Staffing allocations that decreased over time, even as scope increased. That didn't make sense on its own, but it was consistent across projects. There were notes about expected attrition treated as a variable, not a risk. I assumed it meant turnover. That's common enough. It was the way it was modeled that stood out. Attrition curves plotted alongside deliverables. I avoided the protocol documents at first. Instead, I read the outputs. Summaries, tables, internal assessments. They didn't describe procedures directly. They described effects. Workforce language drift was one recurring metric. Not loss of language, exactly, but changes in how terms were used across departments. Reports noted increased clarification requests, longer onboarding times, and a rise in semantic compliance errors. No attempt to explain why, just tracking it. Another recurring metric was memory consistency in test populations. Again, no description of tests, just outcomes. Delayed recall variability, conflicting, increased reliance on written prompts for routine tasks. The tone was neutral. When thresholds were exceeded, the response wasn't to stop. It was to re-baseline. Photographs were present, but they were never the focus of a file. They appeared as appendices. The captions did most of the work. Workspace, post-shift, orientation session, redaction applied. Large blocks of black filled most of the frames. Faces, signage, sometimes entire rooms. The redactions were uniform, applied at ingestion. It suggested the images were never meant to be seen unaltered. Responsibility was spread thinly. Every decision referenced another department. Every department referenced a mandate. No single document owned an outcome. Even the failures were assigned collectively. Cross-functional degradation, one summary called it, as if it were weather. Around that time I started sleeping poorly. Not dramatically. Just waking up earlier than usual, then not getting back to sleep. I logged it the way I log everything else. Date, hours slept, caffeine intake. I told myself it was just too much screen time and the fact that I was reading dense material late at night. There was one directive memo that appeared in several project folders, identical except for the header. It was short. One paragraph. The only quoted language in the whole section was a line near the end. Proceed under continuity assumptions until operationally impossible. No signature. Just an authorization code. That line reframed the first collection for me. The town reports weren't the source material. They were the downstream documentation of these projects reaching their limits. The administrative persistence I'd noticed wasn't resilience. It was followed through. What I didn't realize immediately was that the second collection wasn't static. I noticed it because my local mirror logs didn't match. File sizes changed slightly between sessions. A timestamp updated while I had the folder open. I checked server headers and saw periodic pings, regular, like a heartbeat. The library wasn't finished. It was being added to while I was reading it. I started noticing it because I already had too many tabs open. That's not unusual for me, but this time the overlap was harder to ignore. I'd be reading a project summary in the archive and then, later the same day, see a public notice that used similar phrasing. Not identical, just close enough that it registered. At first I assumed confirmation bias. Once you read a lot of institutional language, it all starts to blur together. Still, I began noting dates. A transportation authority update that quietly reclassified a service reduction as continuity adjustment. A public health bulletin that introduced a new reporting category without explanation. When I checked archived versions of the pages, the changes weren't announced. They were silent edits. No press release. No changelog. I didn't treat this as prediction. I was careful about that. It was pattern recognition at most. The archive wasn't saying what would happen. It was describing how institutions behaved once certain thresholds were crossed. Seeing the same behaviors elsewhere didn't mean cause. It just meant the models were reusable. I kept a separate document for this, listing URLs, timestamps, and cached versions. Nothing dramatic, just notes. Looking back, the act of writing it down felt like an attempt to slow things down, or maybe to anchor myself to something verifiable. What bothered me more than the events was the language. Terms from the second collection started appearing in real communications. Operational impossibility, managed degradation, continuity posture. These weren't common phrases before. When I searched for them, Most results were recent and tied to internal memos that had leaked after the fact. It suggested a shared vocabulary moving outward. I tried to explain this to myself as convergence. Bureaucracies borrow from each other. That happens. Still, I stopped bringing it up casually. Every time I started to describe what I was seeing, it sounded ungrounded, even to me. Like I was stitching unrelated documents together into a narrative that didn't exist. I didn't want to be that person. The archive didn't help with that. It seemed to anticipate skepticism. Many files included notes about external perception thresholds and information fatigue. There were charts modeling disengagement, showing how attention dropped as complexity increased. I wasn't sure what to do with that, except to recognize myself in the margins. Eventually, I decided to share a small portion of what I had with someone I trust professionally. Another researcher, similar background. I chose files that were unremarkable on their own. A funding ledger, a redacted summary. I stripped metadata and sent them with minimal context. I framed it as a formatting question. Their response was neutral, procedural. They noted the consistency, the effort involved. They asked where it came from. I didn't answer directly. After that, the replies slowed, then stopped. I checked in once more a week later. No response. I can't say why. People get busy. Still, I didn't send anything else. After that, I became more cautious. Not just about sharing, but about reading. I noticed I was skipping ahead less, rereading more, as if the order mattered. I started closing the archive when I felt tired, rather than pushing through. I told myself it was about maintaining objectivity. The idea that access itself might matter came to me gradually. Not as a conclusion, but as a working concern. The archive tracked who handled information and how long they stayed engaged. It tracked dropout rates. I was an information handler now, whether I wanted to be or not. My access wasn't passive. Looking back, that's probably when the balance shifted. The library wasn't just documenting outcomes in the abstract. It was responsive. It adjusted to how it was read, how it was ignored, how it was misunderstood. The patterns I was seeing in public weren't echoes. They were alignments. I didn't stop accessing it after that. I just became more aware that doing so was part of the system it described. That awareness didn't change my behavior as much as I thought it would. It mostly made me quieter. The breach wasn't obvious when it happened. There was no alert or lockout. I noticed it because my mirror script threw a warning about an unexpected path. At first I assumed I'd misconfigured something. I reran the crawl with stricter parameters and got the same result. There was a new folder at the root level. It hadn't been there the previous night. The name wasn't descriptive. It was a hash. At first glance, it looked like any other identifier in the archive. When I compared it to my access logs, I realized it matched my user hash exactly, down to the last character. I checked permissions. Still no upload rights. No obvious write access. The server treated it like any other directory. That was almost more unsettling than if it had been flagged. Inside were summaries. Not documents in the same sense as the rest of the archive. These were shorter, mostly text files and tables. The headers used a classification I hadn't seen before, handler_observation. Each file was time-stamped, some going back weeks. I hadn't noticed them because they weren't linked from anywhere else. The content was analytical, metrics heavy. It tracked engagement patterns, session lengths, file revisit frequency. It logged periods of inactivity and correlated them with external events, like holidays or known news cycles. There were charts modeling silence rates, defined as time between exposure and disengagement. I was listed as subject active. I told myself this was coincidence, that the hash collision meant something else, but the details were too specific. One table referenced a gap in my access that matched a weekend I'd been out of town. Another noted increased dwell time on municipal reports, which aligned with my own read log. There was no commentary, no judgment, just observation. One file summarized compliance behaviors across multiple subjects. It wasn't just me. There were dozens of hashes listed. Most were marked inactive. Some had notes indicating self-termination of access. A few were flagged for external disclosure attempt, followed by a drop to zero activity. No outcomes listed beyond that. Near the end of my own summary was an evaluation line. It was the only complete sentence in the file, set apart from the tables. It read, "Subject continues engagement under awareness conditions. Proceed without intervention." That was it. No signature. I sat with that longer than I want to admit, not because it felt threatening, but because it reframed everything I'd already read. The archive wasn't just documenting collapse or continuity or whatever term applied. It was documenting interaction with the documentation. Endings weren't just events. They were processes, tracked until attention ran out. Once I saw the rest of the archive made more sense in an uncomfortable way. The shortened historical memory I'd noticed wasn't accidental. There were metrics for it. How many revisions before context was dropped? How long institutions could function on procedure alone? At what point ethical review became a formality rather than a constraint? There were cultural summaries, too, aggregated. They didn't predict outcomes. They logged acceptance curves. How quickly managed decline became normal once it was framed correctly. How procedural morality replaced deliberation. None of it claimed inevitability. It was all past tense, even when referencing ongoing systems. I didn't see myself as special in any of this. The archive treated me as a data point. That was part of the problem. There was no antagonist to react against, just a system observing its own effects, adjusting its documentation strategy accordingly. I disconnected after that. Not permanently, just long enough to think. I reviewed my local copies and realized I had more than I needed to demonstrate the structure, even without sharing raw content. I also realized that whatever this was, it accounted for disclosure. It had thresholds for it. That meant silence wasn't neutral, but neither was speaking. This post is my attempt at a controlled leak. I'm not releasing files. I'm releasing process, metadata, descriptions, enough to establish that the library exists and how it operates, without adding new variables. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if it changes anything. What I do know is that the archive documents endings because it requires them to complete its models. Engagement ends. Institutions end. Attention ends. Recording, that is the point. I'm still listed as active. I assume that will change once this is posted. I've logged the time. I'm writing this before I check. This isn't a warning. I'm not asking anyone to act on this. What I'm leaving here is an evidentiary summary, because that's the only frame that still makes sense to me. The archive already models reaction and disbelief. Adding another attempt at persuasion would just create noise in the dataset. I'm releasing an outline and metadata only. That decision comes directly from the risk models I saw in the second collection. There were multiple files outlining disclosure thresholds and secondary spread effects. Full document dumps correlated with rapid disengagement and loss of context. Partial releases preserved attention longer. That wasn't presented as advice, just a measured outcome. I'm treating it as a constraint. Before writing this, I backed up the archive to cold storage. 2 offline drives, encrypted, stored separately. I verified hashes and then disconnected them. After that, I intentionally corrupted my access keys. Not deleted, corrupted. Enough that they wouldn't authenticate cleanly even if restored. That wasn't about erasing traces. It was about ending a session definitively. I documented that too. Timestamp method, expected failure modes. Old habits. I didn't feel any sense of relief when it was done. Mostly I was checking boxes. Some things have already changed in measurable ways. My average daily reading time is down, but my reread rate is up. I cross-check sources more often, even when there's no immediate need. I've stopped using certain phrases in email because they feel imprecise now. I didn't notice these shifts while they were happening. I only saw them when I compared logs. I'm also quieter, not withdrawn, just more selective. That shows up in message counts and response times. I used to think that was just fatigue. Looking back, it aligns with the archive's engagement curves more closely than I'd like. The library doesn't predict the end of humanity. It doesn't need to. It standardizes it. It reduces complex, lived processes into categories that institutions can continue to operate within, even as capacity drops. That's not a prophecy. It's an administrative function, one that appears to be running continuously. The last server response I received before corrupting my keys was unremarkable. No warning, no acknowledgement, just a standard header and a content length value that matched the previous session. I logged it out of habit. HTTP 1.1200 OK date Tuesday 14 Januari tahun 2026 jam 2:17 43 detik. GMT tag 9F3C 1A2B7D4 E6C90. Content length 184,233. Shao 256 and 6 de 8. E9F4 a 12-3. B1 E0 de 7 a 9. C8 F5 E4 B2 de 1 a 0. C9 E8 F7 de 6. C5 B4A. 392-817-1615-1413-121110. That's the last confirmed interaction I have with it. Everything after that is inference. I'm not claiming this archive is complete or unique. It may be one instance of a broader class of systems. I don't have visibility beyond what I accessed, and even that was filtered by my own behavior. The archive accounted for that. It always does. This post isn't meant to be believed. Belief is a short-lived state, and the archive tracks how quickly it decays. Preservation lasts longer. That's what this is for. To exist somewhere that isn't optimized, categorized, or immediately actionable. If this disappears, that's consistent too. Loss is part of the model. If it stays, it becomes another reference point. I don't know which outcome is more likely, and I'm not trying to influence it. What I do know is that the archive's final requirement isn't compliance or silence. It's continuity of record. Someone, somewhere, needs to note that this existed, even if nothing comes of it. Even if it's misfiled or ignored. I've logged the posting time. After this, I'm stepping back. Whether that registers as disengagement or something else isn't up to me anymore.